So, good evening, everybody. Welcome to the World Economic Forum in Latin America in São Paulo. I am Luciana Coelho, foreign editor with Folha de São Paulo, leading newspaper in Brazil. And we are here to discuss the place of Latin America in a deals-based global orders. And we have some very important people here who used to work with governments and now are in the private initiative. I think all of you, right? And I'll start introducing Mr. Arturo Valenzuela, who worked in the Clinton and Obama administration. And he is now with Covington and Burling, right, as a Latin America advisor, right? Mr. Rodrigo Vergara, on my left, was the governor for the Chilean Central Bank until December and is now with the Centro de Estudios Publicos de Chile, right? Mr. Kjell Grandhagen was the head of the National Intelligence Service, Norway, and is a geopolitics advisor with Norwegian bank DNB. And Mrs. Soledad Jiménez Garcia, Trinidad, pardon. Trinidad Jiménez García-Herrera was foreign minister with under Rodrigo Zapatero administration, and is now head of strategy with public affairs with Telefonica. So welcome.
Thank you.
And well, we're here to try to take the pulse of the multilateral system, especially the way Latin America can insert itself in a world that is changing or seems to be changing from multilateral negotiations and cooperation to a deals-based order. And before we came inside, you were telling me, Mr. Vergara, that you don't agree with this premise. So I'll start provoking you, asking you to tell us why you disagree.
Thank you, Luciana. It is not that I disagree. I think that this is not black and white. There are a lot of grays here. So if the question is it correct to say that the world is moving to a deal-based order, I would say that the answer to that question is yes. After all, there's enough examples and a long enough period of time in which this has been happening. But on the other hand, if the question is if this is the end of the rule-based order that we have known since the World War II, I think that the answer is no, or probably not. At least I am relatively optimistic on that matter. At the end, I think that the question is whether the trend that we've seen over the last many years is a structural change or is a part of a cycle. This is a wave. After all, if you see the recent history, the last 70 years, you see waves or cycles in which the rule-based world sometimes is stronger and sometimes is weaker. And we might be in one of these waves in which, the rule-based world is becoming weaker or is in a crisis, as Arturo, we were talking before. But I don't think that this is necessarily the end of it. I'm pretty much aware of the problems of the last many years, the immigration in Europe, the problem of immigration in Europe, Brexit, Russia, and of course, above all, Trump. But on the other hand, I think that there are strong forces, many forces, for maintaining a rule-based order since it's during the period in which we have had this order, the world has experienced an amazing increase in welfare, in well-being. The there's a lot of resistance. So I'm optimistic in the sense that I think that this resistance might finally succeed. And we might go back or, go to the other part of the cycle. Even in the US, you see, with such a strong institution, with the check and balances, you see a resistance. You see what happens in Congress, even in the White House. Of course, if you're too resistant, you end up being fired. But I think that there are good reasons to think that this is not a structural change, but rather a more sort of a part of a cycle. That's my own my whole
I think
point.
you may agree with him, right, Mr. Grandhagen? You're saying that we have seen trends like this in the past.
Yeah, and I think it's very important that we keep in mind that this is about much more than just trade, which is very high on the agenda right now. But, for example, the United Nations has been under pressure for a very long time, up and down, but it's almost been a constant pressure towards the United Nations over the last 20 years. We have seen what has happened with the European Union. That is under pressure currently, has been for a while. Even a very strong organization, multinational organization like NATO, has had periods with big difficulties in defining its purpose. Forces countering multilateralism and rules-based order is nothing new. The new thing now is that it is attacking the rules-based order within trade, and that is coming to the attention. And I think there are reasons why that is happening, of course. I was a bit encouraged this morning when Pelé got his award and heard Mr. Schwab talking about the collaborative competition and the competitive collaboration and about the reasons for fair play within the trade field. And I think that is the reason very much why the rules-based order is now being challenged, because people are not sure that the current set of rules that we operate under are fair and advocate fair play. So I think it's very important to keep that in mind as a background.
I'd like to bring Trinidad to the conversation, talk about European Union. So we all here are optimists, I think. We defend globalism and believe in these institutions. But the European Union just passed through something that I think no one was expecting. Neither people who study these trends, which was Brexit. Well, it's still to happen, but they voted. What do you think that, you have the background as a foreign minister and was involved in the discussions for the EU. What do you think came wrong that made the British people decide to vote for the exit, and what we can use globally from this episode? What we can learn from that?
Well, this is a very difficult question. If you don't mind, I will shift in Spanish. You have a very Spanish-speaking audience here. Well, es realmente muy complicado saber por qué los británicos en un determinado momento decidieron abandonar o decir que querían abandonar la Unión Europea. Yo creo que la Unión Europea es una experiencia de gran éxito como conjunto regional integrado en el ámbito del comercio, en el ámbito de las relaciones exteriores, en el ámbito de la moneda común, en el ámbito de las fronteras. Realmente ha sido una experiencia de un gran éxito. El Reino Unido, los británicos siempre tuvieron una posición muy especial dentro de...
A very special position within the European Union. They were never fully in agreement with the political and economic integration. I think this is a reality. And presently, for electoral reasons in the United Kingdom, a referendum was carried out, and people did not truly vote whether they wish to continue or not as part of the union. People voted on whether they were comfortable or not with what was happening in their countries. Therefore, there are multiple causes that led the British citizens to vote to leave the European Union. But I would like to mention a caveat. The Brexit has not materialized so far, and I don't know if this will ever materialize. The present day trend in the world is towards the integration of states, and all of the disintegration processes go against history. In a globalized world, the countries that are far from international partnerships make no sense. They have no future. And when the United Kingdom is negotiating its exit from the European Union, simultaneously it is negotiating partnerships to be able to remain within the Union. And the European Union is renegotiating its partnerships with Mexico, with Chile, renegotiating its partnership with Brazil, and is now concluding its negotiation with Mercosur. It has completed the negotiation with Colombia and Peru, and Ecuador has joined into the process. Now, this is the direction of history, regional alliances, and once again, the European Union has been a success. And somebody asked me my vision of Latin America. I look upon Latin America as an integrated unit. For Latin America to have strength in the global scenario, for Latin America to have a voice, a strong voice. It already is strong. Latin America can be compared to the fifth world power in terms of foreign investment, in terms of GDP. It is behind the United States, the European Union, China, Japan, and the fifth power would be Latin America. And it should make this additional effort towards integration with the Pacific Alliance or Mercosur or whatever. It will make no difference. Trade integration, a political integration, an economic integration, an infrastructure integration, because this will give it great strength. And it is through integration that it will gain that relevant voice worldwide, especially if we think that United States is beginning to close its frontiers. Arturo will speak about this, that protectionist stance. And if it closes its frontiers, it will come out as a loser. And of course, countries will look elsewhere. They will look to Asia. And China has become ever stronger in Latin America. In Brazil, it is the main foreign investor, ahead of the United States, and of course, ahead of Spain. Arturo.
By chance, so.
Bueno, muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, and I fully agree with all of you.
Completely in agreement with everybody. One thing about my bio, I'm an academic actually, who spent most years in the academy, and I just deviated 3 times to go into the US government. But ironically, I've deviated again, and I'm with this law firm, and this law firm, Covington and Burling, has a connection to all of the things that we've been talking about. The first connection is with a young associate at the firm. Back when the firm was starting, this is after the Great Depression, that finds itself representing the government of Norway against the United States, because the government of Norway had ordered some ships. And the United States, when the war began, basically took over those ships and weren't willing to pay the government of Norway. And the person who won this challenge against the government of Norway, against the United States, in favor of the government of Norway on the building of the ships, was Dean Acheson, a very young lawyer then at Covington and Burling, this law firm that we're talking about. Dean Acheson later would go into the State Department in the Roosevelt last term of Franklin Roosevelt. He was Assistant Secretary for International Conferences, and he was Assistant Secretary for Cooperation and that kind of thing. So he was there when, in 1944, you get Bretton Woods. In 1945, you get the United Nations in San Francisco, Bretton Woods in New Hampshire. And he was there when the GATT in 1947 is developed. And he wrote a book called President the Creation, because he was Secretary of State then for Truman when all the entire world order that we're talking about was created. The multilateralism, you know, on the issue of relationships among states, and the multilateralism on issues of trade, and multilateralism on the issues of international finance, because you know what Bretton Woods was essentially putting in some order into that. So I've learned a lot by sitting at this firm, listening to all these things that are relevant for our conversation today, because effectively the question is then not so much what alliances should be, but what's happening to that order. And I am fairly optimistic that that order is going in the right direction, despite the ups and downs, and the history does show us several ups and downs. In fact, as a political scientist, I'm worried about the politics at this particular point than about the economics. But at any rate, you know, they're related. Let me just sort of wind up by drawing from my own experience. I went into the Clinton administration the first time, not knowing one country really well in all of Latin America. I wanted to do South America. That was my field. I'm of Chilean background, so Vergara and I have the same nationality. But I was put in charge of the relationship with Mexico. In that exquisite logic of bureaucracies. The country that you don't know, we're going to put you there because we had somebody else named for the other countries. And then I had to do NAFTA. Now, why am I referring to this at the time? President Clinton wasn't going to sign NAFTA. It was negotiated by President Bush. And this is a really significant step forward in the modern sort of economic integration process. What does Clinton do when he's finally elected? He decides, well, look, maybe we should look at this again, but we need to add some additional elements to it. And there were the labor agreements, there were the environmental agreements, there were different kinds of dispute resolution agreements, and trade adjustment authority. And I mentioned trade adjustment authority because the Republicans never liked trade adjustment. Trade adjustment authority is putting money into those communities that lose with globalization, new training and that kind of stuff. So that was really important. I had to actually negotiate the implementation of NAFTA at the time. So I've seen this very closely. I became very convinced. Trade between Mexico and the United States then was about $70 billion. Today it's about $675 million. The value chains that have been created in North America have made that region one of the most competitive in the world. And it's thanks to NAFTA that worked. Now, I went back to Georgetown, and then President Clinton asked me to go back into the White House. And what does he do when I'm there? I'm very frustrated because there was one country that he didn't sign the free trade agreement with, was Chile. And you know why he didn't sign Chile then? I found out because of the politics of Washington. And what did the administration want to do then? Charlene Barshevsky and USTR, they wanted to do China PNTR. And China PNTR was essentially providing China with, you know, normal trade relationships. And that permits China then to come into the WTO. And remember, the WTO was founded in 1994, too. Also, in the Clinton administration, it replaces GATT. Why is this important? It means that you had the development of a consensus in the United States between Democrats and Republicans that even though you had to sort of face the challenges of globalization and with different sorts of formula, that there was a consensus to do that. I don't think that consensus business is gone, even though, ironically,
You don't
Bernie
think so?
Sanders is the closest ally of Trump in
Yes.
terms of... So the two extremes of the parties in the United States are... But I concur with the notion that why is it unlikely that the United States is going to withdraw from the trade size of these sorts of things? One, because the American industry understands that that's the case. Two, because the Europeans and others, and they're rightly upset because, you know, we won't get into technical reasons for it, this business of appealing to national security grounds, you know, on the basis of the 1962 Trade Adjustment Authority Act, and then going to Chapter 6 in the WTO and things like that, which is not going to work anyway. You know, but the Europeans are basically saying, oh, we can then retaliate. We can take you to the WTO. And American industry is not going to like that, and it's already beginning to happen. Even in Pennsylvania, if you saw the election yesterday in Pennsylvania, or the day before yesterday, no, yesterday in Pennsylvania, you know, Trump won this state by 20%, you know? And even Pennsylvanian people in Trump land are saying, is this going to really hurt us or not? And trade is part of the thing, so they're understanding that. So, American industry is not in that direction. There is a centrist consensus in the United States in favor of these sorts of things. The European Union is being very smart, as are the Mexicans, in saying, okay, if we're going to go ahead and retaliate, you know, by putting in our own, you know, what are we going to do? We're going to pick the various different states, precisely, you know, to do that.
They did so.
And they're already doing that.
Yeah.
They're already doing that. And you know, and farmers in Iowa and other places like that are very upset now that the Mexicans are not going to buy, you know, barley for their beer and things like that. And the agricultural industry in the United States would be hurt very significantly by this. So there are reasons why this is not going to. Now I'm a little bit, and I'll finish here, because otherwise, as a professor, I only speak 45 minutes exactly in a row. You know. I am actually worried about the politics of the world, perhaps even more than sort of the underlying institutions and things like trade and so on and so forth. And the politics of the world are complicated today. And Trinidad really put her finger on it. And in some ways, and this is where Latin America should not be as worried. You know, I agree with you completely. There is one continent in the world that in the 21st century is not suffering from what the Italians call irredentus politics, irredenta, which is what? You know, that is the desire of subalternate loyalties to be able to establish their own sovereignty in the world. You know, which is what Catalonia is all about, which is what Brexit really in some ways is too. It's Scotland versus Wales versus the Great Britain and so on and so forth. Latin American countries don't have that. When Subcomandante Marcos arose, and on the 1st of January of 1994, the day that NAFTA is actually implemented, issues his decree against the Mexican government, he's not there thinking about a República Maya, you know, that would include Guatemala and Belize and all that kind of stuff. He's thinking really about the revindications, you know, that the Mexican government owed him. So the Western Hemisphere, with the possible exception of Canada at certain points, is the one place in the world, in terms of a continent, you know, and this includes North America, South America, Central America, and so forth, of the longest nation states. And all you need to do is to go back to the President of the Creation. Who were the countries? 20%, 50% of the countries that signed the United Nations were Latin American countries. You know, 50% of the countries that signed Bretton Woods were Latin American countries because the rest of the world was still empires without independent states. India was not represented. It was represented by the British authorities. So I'll end there. So this is the challenge. The challenge really is we're facing a world where you have irredentus politics, you know, and then we also, and here my political science hat is still on, you know, we're also facing a problem of rule of law, generally. We cannot have an international rules-based system if we don't have this rule of law and governing institutions that work properly in our own countries. No tiene sentido. No tiene sentido. Uno no puede, you know? We can't just simply say, actually that's something I also learned from Covington, and I'll end with this, because the colleagues at Covington are colleagues that have been when they were in the Justice Department. Eric Holder's back at the firm now, What did they do? In the Justice Department of the United States, and it's something that myself I was upset about. I did not like the extraterritoriality of United States law. But what were they doing? They were saying, if Siemens wants to come and list on the New York Stock Exchange, and it wants to sell in the United States, and in fact, it wants to build factories in the United States, it cannot bribe officials in Nigeria because that's an uncompetitive thing. And so one of the things that's behind all of this, I think, about the changing rules of the international system also, is that increasingly we don't accept that. But you cannot have a rules-based international system until you also have the rule of law within countries and governing institutions that work. I'll stop there.
If you might just follow up on that, I agree with those now saying that, particularly in the trade field, I think we're not where multinationalism will stop and globalization will stop. But there are other trends from a geopolitical point of view that I find a bit concerning. That has to do with the respect for international law. Take, for example, the Chinese approach in the South China Sea. Take the Russian annexation of Crimea. You could mention a few other examples. With the US now withdrawing its interest from the rest of the world to a large extent, with a Europe that is more or less has become very introvert, focusing on solving the European problems and less of an actor on the global field, with the uncertainty of what sort of China we are seeing and a Russia that is acting relatively aggressively on the international scene. What does this do with the international order, the global order, the world order in a longer term? I worry that we are heading towards some sort of a zero-polar world, which opens up for rogue states, for more conflicts, for more terrorism, a lot of that, since the sense and respect for a world order, a rules-based system is fading. So I think we should keep also that in mind.
I pretty much, sorry.
No, it's okay. You can.
Pretty much agree with that. Now, I definitely think that those are the biggest problems facing in the world right now. Now, going back to trade, it seems that we all think that this is, some sort of cyclical stuff. We have had ups and downs over the last many decades. And now there's a wave of protectionism, but even that wave has a lot of resistance, like the case of Brexit that I was mentioning, in the sense that the vote were today, and we don't know what the result would be, and we don't know whether it's going to be Brexit at the end. But on the other hand, let's assume that we're wrong, and this is not, a sort of a part of a cycle or a wave. This is a structural change. If that were the case, I think that is very bad news for Latin America. I think that if I heard you well, you said something like, this will be good news for Latin America in the sense that we can, seize other opportunities. I think if the US becomes more protectionist, and if there is retaliation, this is bad news for the whole world. And definitely, it's bad for everybody. And in a deal-based order, I think that's bad news for Latin America. If that was the case, I think it is bad news for Latin America because, after all, it's a more discretionary world. Generally, I think it's probably worse for small countries. I could say it's more prone probably to bad practices, to more corruption. And this is not a region which is especially strong on those items. So I think if that were the case, I think that would be bad news. I don't think that that's the case. But if that were the case, I absolutely think that would be.
But I'd say about the region, something is different. It seems that we're still struggling with corruption. We still have our populists. But it seems the institutions are working a little better, right? You don't have so much stability as you had in the past in Latin America.
From a macroeconomic perspective, I think that's correct. I mean, macroeconomic policies, I'm talking about monetary fiscal policy, they've improved significantly. You don't have well, with the, of course, big exception of Venezuela, we don't have
Yes.
this huge inflations and budget deficits and current account deficit that we had in the past. But from an institutional point of view, I think that, there are many countries that have improved a lot. And I come from the Pacific Alliance, and I think that the countries of the Pacific Alliance have had significant improvements in terms of their institutionality. I think that also countries from the Atlantic have improved, but by less. So there's a lot to do yet in the region in terms of the institutional framework.
Estaba pensando anteriormente cuando mencionabas que era una mala noticia para América Latina el proteccionismo de Estados Unidos. Es cierto, Estados Unidos es un gran país.
Big country and a country with an enormous influence and with an extraordinary trade with Latin America, especially with Mexico, and evidently that this is a problem if it starts closing its frontiers and the confrontation with European Union. But when I talk about opportunities, I mean that Latin America as a region must look for its strength in other markets. They may strengthen their relation with European Union, and that is good for European Union because we have cultural similarities and political and historical points in common that allow us to get stronger. If U.S. doesn't want to participate in the world trade, well, in the traditional terms, as to open the markets, well, you will see what is your future. But European Union and Latin America are ready to strengthen their commercial relations as well as the political relations. But Latin America can also strengthen the relations with the southeastern countries. And I was referring to opportunities. There is a big dependence with the trade between Mexico and U.S., and that's a big problem nowadays. But I was thinking also about the opportunities that this may mean to Latin America. I've known Latin America in our original countries. In the year '85, I traveled for the first time to Chile during the Pinochet's dictatorship. And I had just left the Uruguayan dictatorship, and Argentina and Brazil also. I have known that Latin America and the Latin America with the wars in Central America. And I have known the difficulties. And now I see Latin America. And of course, I can only think of Latin America in terms of opportunity and with optimism. I agree with you. We must be optimistic because there is no regional group in the world more homogeneous in terms of political stability. Of course, we have many problems like in the rest of the world. There are many problems yet. We have to work on transparency. We have to work on against corruption, instability of the institutions, etc. But maybe because I have known Latin America for 30 years, I'm in the conditions to make an analysis because I have traveled a lot. I beg your pardon. Even though we have all of these similarities, we cannot, we still don't obtain an integration. Even Mercosur nowadays, the Pacific Alliance, there is nothing really well succeeded in terms of integration in Latin America. Yes, you're right, but there has been integration. The Central American integration, for example, there is an integration now with the multi-party integration between Colombia, Peru, and Ecuador. Also, there is a good integration in Mercosur. I believe in that. So it's not the integration of like in the European Union that has lasted for more than 50 years, but it is an incipient integration that can be applied to the present scenario. I believe the Pacific Alliance has improved the integration. They have even embassies and they have diplomacy in common. And now I will refer to the telephone part. we have the digital agenda, and this has brought upon the integration. It's a key for the future. It's true that we don't have very good physical infrastructure, but we have very good digital infrastructure, and this is a very good opportunity for Latin America that can be integrated with the digital revolution, looking in equal conditions to U.S. and European Union, because it has a very good digital infrastructure, and they have to use this. And that's why I'm talking about opportunities. It's ridiculous that me from Spain can speak of opportunities for Latin America, but that's what I want.
The notion that what we're facing is a very difficult political world as well. It's just not an issue of trade. One of the things that somebody with the experience that I had in the U.S. government at the White House and the National Security Council and so on is that we always had clear that what we had, there were 3 Ds. We should talk about 3 Ds. The first D is diplomacy, and diplomacy is critical. The second D was development. And this goes back to the Truman Doctrine, you know, and the Truman Plan, and so on and so forth after World War II. You know, cooperación internacional. You know, and the third D, of course, is defense. And our friends in defense will say, you know, we don't want to work just on defense without diplomacy, and that's a fundamental concept. These are 3 Ds, and one of the things that's discouraging about this particular White House is because it's focusing only on defense as its fundamental strategy, and it's letting diplomacy go away. I agree with you to move to a comment on each one, that the frightful decade of the 1980s was overcome precisely because you had a capacity of governments throughout the region to impose what was called economic stabilization policies and structural reforms and market opening and so on and so forth. I have 2 little bills in my wallet. I won't bring them out, but it's a 500,000 Cruzeiro bill that I show my students, and I also show it to my because there's a Bolivian. This is 1980s Latin America. Where's the camera?
Where's my camera?
500,000 cruzeiros. Momento. 10 millones de bolivianos. 10 millones de bolivianos. And with 10 millones de bolivianos, you had to carry wheelbarrows down the streets of La Paz in order to buy a loaf of bread. And then let me finish with this. And that is, the point is well taken that Latin America needs to look at the European Union and other places like that. The focus should not just be, but I'm not sure that it has been a focus on the United States for a long period of time. One thing that is clear is that 45% of all U.S. exports to the world go to the Western Hemisphere. So it is something of great importance for the United States. When I went to Beijing as Assistant Secretary of State for the United States of America, and I sat down with the Foreign Ministry people and with you know, the Ministry of International Commerce and so with some of the others, you know, the question was always, don't you worry, you know, are we competing? My answer was this: bienvenido that Latin American countries could sell their copper. They're not selling copper to the United States. The United States is self-sufficient in copper. Let them sell. 3 products at one point were 70% of the exports to China: iron ore, copper, and soybeans. All right? Now, the other 30% is a lot of things like that. The United States doesn't need copper or iron ore or soybeans, for that matter. So what is in the interest of the United States in terms of, for the countries of Latin America to have significant relationships with the European Union? You know, the United States, in the administration that I represented, welcomed the fact that Latin American countries were looking for trade opportunities elsewhere that would enhance the possibility for the United States itself.
That's been happening. I mean,
it's been happening.
Let me just mention briefly in the case of Chile. I mean, in 1990, only less than 1% of Chilean exports went to China. Now it's close to 30%, 3-0. It's by far the largest trading partner. And the US is the second or third after the EU.
Now, is that bad for the United States? No, it's good for the United States, because you could also buy Apple phones and so on from the United States and things like that. So that's what the world global environment is all about.
I want to take back to what you said about defense and diplomacy.
Yeah.
We just had President Trump changing his Secretary of State for the head of CIA. So what do you think it says about diplomacy for the U.S. right now?
It's extremely dangerous. It's not a good idea. You know, in some ways, the best experience I had was having worked at the State Department and then being the lead person for the National Security Council for the Western Hemisphere, was the importance of coordination among various different agencies of the United States, you know, ministries and so on and so forth. The key to any kind of government is to be able to coordinate a whole host of different sorts of interests. There is no functioning interagency process in the United States, and the State Department has been excluded from many of these things, and some of the most capable diplomats have had to leave. This is extremely worrisome, and I concur in that sense with the fact that perhaps more than my fear about trade is the fear about a world, you know, that is still very dangerous in terms of significant challenges, whether it's the Middle East, whether it's the issue of Afghanistan, Pakistan, and and then North Korea, not to even talk about that. China. You know, a meeting like the meeting that's supposedly being planned now on North Korea is something that would have had a State Department lead for a long period of time, clear coordination with the National Security Council and all of the agencies, because you never want to do a meeting like that without knowing what the outcome is going to be. You know, one thing I learned in government that I didn't learn in academia is you never walk into a meeting unless you know exactly what's going to be decided in that meeting, and it makes sure that it's going to be decided in the direction that you want it to be decided, right? What do you do?
I fully agree with that, but on the other hand, I think seen from the outside and from a small country that I come from, one of the big problems with U.S. foreign policy over the last year has been the division between the White House foreign policy and the State Department foreign policy, which has been very difficult to deal with. So at least if something good comes out of it, it's the possibility to align the two in foreign policy. But I would like to return to the trade issue because I think we should not overestimate the challenge that is now being posed by what's happening in the U.S. Keep in mind that as late as yesterday, Donald Trump appointed a new economic advisor who is very much against the tariff policy that has come from President Trump. That the majority of Republicans in Congress are definitely against his policy. So you could also see the proposals from the White House as a sort of a test balloon towards the rest of the world and as a starting point for further negotiations. So I think rather than immediately taking the defensive position of asking what sort of retribution should we come up with in this, try to explore also other venues here. I think there's a huge scope for still influencing U.S. decisions here. I think that can be done by rationalizing the consequences of a trade war, by appealing to the U.S. population who will suffer from increased prices on steel and aluminum products. And if this continues and escalates on a lot of other products as well.
So I think you believe they can backtrack?
I think it's absolutely, and I think it's still possible to influence Congress on this. And I think it's also possible to continue the multilateral and rules-based approach in parallel with doing that. Keep in mind what happened with the when the U.S. withdrew from the Paris Accord on climate change. The answer from the rest of the world was, okay, let the U.S. do whatever they want to do with this. We will continue, and we will have the same goals. Who stood out as a loser in this. I think the U.S. did, and I think the U.S. is still looking for a way out of this. So the same could very easily happen in the trade field. I don't want to say that we don't have a challenge, because we definitely do, but don't jump to quick conclusions.
So I want to open at least 5 minutes for the audience if they want to make questions. But first, for what I understood, all four of you think that the multilateral system is still very strong and vigorous, and it can live side by side on with this deal-based. I won't use the word order, but deals-based agreement and vision of the world. So, if you have to take, all of you, one thing that we could change right now to take the better side of the two things, what you would say? What can we do right now to improve the system?
If I may start on that, again, I think it's important to go back to what are the roots of the current trends that we see. I pointed to one, the fact that many don't see the current trade arrangements as being a fair play. I think that is very important. We need to focus on that, and we need to address those specific situations. I think it's obvious that Trump has some reason when he attacks China on trade policies, for example. He's absolutely right in a lot of that, and I think the Europeans are coming to the same conclusions. There are things that needs to be addressed with China, and it's fair to do that. You don't need to tear down the whole global system in order to do that, but you need to address the flip sides of the current system. The other thing about globalization in general that I think has caused many of the problems within the European Union is the lack of trust in the supranational structures of Europe. So Britain is not the only country that has questioned the huge powers of Brussels. There's been a movement throughout Europe addressing that. I fully agree with you on the need for integration, but let's face it, European politicians haven't succeeded in convincing the broader population in Europe that everything that is done by the European Union is right. So there are challenges here. Many will blame globalization for the fact that the wages have stood still for so long, both in the US and in Europe. So we have challenges here that we need to face, and if we don't address them, this is going to be a problem also in the future.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yo creo que no es un problema de confianza en las instituciones europeas, que también hay un problema de confianza. Hay un problema de confianza en general con los sistemas políticos. Sí. Entonces, el malestar de los ciudadanos no es en particular con el presidente Juncker.
Of citizens is not with President Juncker, the president of the European Union. They do not even know his name. Their ill ease refers to the government, to the situation, the lack of expectations. It's what the French would call malaise, Arturo. You and I speak French. Malaise. That discontent, that ill feeling that citizens tend to have with political systems. And what should we do about this? We need to strengthen those spaces of cooperation that exist in the general order so that we can come to an agreement. And I need to say this, the most powerful country in the world that continues to be United States cannot allow itself to make changes and make decisions that are risky in such a sensitive area such as trade, defense, or diplomacy. They cannot allow themselves to do this because it will have an impact on the rest of the world. We need to have diplomacy in United States, a diplomacy that will be predictable. Allow me to make a comment on this. So far, we have not remarked upon the following, and we have not spoken about what will happen with this president and the problems that this president has. Before doing this, I would like to mention a classical book that was written by Richard Newstack, and a small book that is called Presidential Power, that refers to the day after. He was an advisor for Truman, and he refers to the day after Eisenhower was elected as a president.
Political ability. But presidential power, he adds a corollary, is also this. Presidential power is directly related to the popularity of the president. There's an inverse correlation, you know. So a failed president is an unpopular president. Now, I'm talking about the president's ability to lead under the current circumstances, but there are two other elephants in the room. And I use the word elephant, but no, it has to do with the Republican Party. When is the Republican Party going to realize that Trump is not really a supporter of the party, but in fact a liability for the party, a liability for the party? And you know, we saw the results in Pennsylvania, we saw the results in Louisiana, and so the Republican Party that is the champion of free trade historically is maybe going to have to come around on this issue. And then I'll end with this. This is a presidency which we don't know what's going to happen, because the investigations that are taking place through the law enforcement authorities of the United States are very, very, very serious. And it's not about intervention necessarily in the election. It's about many more things. It's not about collusion, but why collusion? And it may even be about money laundering at some point. So we don't know whether this is going to be a one-term president yet. I think it's going to be a one-term president. There may be even a question whether it's going to even end before the first term. Oh, there you go. We'll leave it at that.
I think that, well, I'm absolutely with you. I mean, I tend to think that he's going to be a one-term president, hopefully. I hope. No, I think that, I mean, we sort of all agree that globalization is free trade is a positive sum game. But we, as Kjell mentioned, we overlooked the fact that there are some losers. So we have to take care of those losers. That has to do a lot with education, with reskilling, with the labor market. So I think that that's a big challenge that we have for the future.
Right. Do you think our region is prepared?
I think our region should be preparing. We are getting aware of this, but I think we're not. I think we should do a lot more than what we are doing now.
Okay. I don't think we will have time for questions by the audience. But thank you very much for the conversation, very interesting. I wish we could stay a little longer, but unfortunately, I have to say goodbye. Thank you very much for being in this session and hearing us.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.